Bible stories to sleep to. Welcome, dear friend, as you settle into your cozy spot, ready to drift into peaceful slumber. Here, in this timeless setting, people held on to their beliefs with steadfast trust, even when facing their darkest moments, believing that even death won't hold the beloved of God. 1. Elijah and the widow's son. 1 Kings 17 verses 17 to 24. A tale of faith and miracles. In Israel, a severe drought that had turned the once fertile land into a barren wasteland. The skies were empty, and the earth cried out for rain. This was no ordinary drought. It was a punishment from God, proclaimed by the prophet Elijah, to call the people back to repentance and away from their sinful ways. The drought's reach extended far beyond Israel's borders, even to the small town of Zarephath in the region of Sidon. Here, a poor widow and her young son fought a daily battle against hunger. Their pantry was nearly empty, with only a handful of flour and a few drops of oil left. Each day was a desperate struggle to survive, and the widow had almost given up hope. She decided to gather some sticks, prepare one final meal, and then face the inevitable end with her son. But God had a different plan. One day, as the widow went about her meager tasks, a stranger appeared. He was a rugged man, likely worn by his time in the wilderness. This was Elijah, the prophet of God, sent to Zarephath by divine instruction. God had promised that a widow would provide for him, though it seemed an impossible request given the dire circumstances. Elijah approached the widow and asked for a drink of water. As she turned to fetch it, he added, "Bring me a piece of bread as well." Her heart must have sunk. How could she explain that she had nothing to spare? "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I have no bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." But Elijah's response was unexpected. He told her not to be afraid. "Go home and do as you have said," he instructed. "But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have. Then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." Faith is not always easy, especially when it requires giving away the little you have. Yet, the widow chose to trust Elijah's words. She prepared the bread and shared it with him, believing in the promise of God. What happened next was truly miraculous. Day after day, the jar of flour remained full, and the jug of oil continued to provide. No matter how much she used, there was always enough for another meal. For the first time in a long time, the widow and her son experienced hope. The relief that flooded her heart was immense. No longer did she need to fear the gnawing pain of hunger or the sorrow of watching her child suffer. God's provision through Elijah was abundant, and it sustained them through the darkest days of the famine. But just when it seemed the storm had passed, a new trial loomed on the horizon. One morning, the widow's son fell ill. At first, it may have seemed like a minor sickness, but his condition quickly worsened. The boy's breaths became shallow, his skin pale. Despite her best efforts, the widow could do nothing to save him. And then, the unthinkable happened. Her son stopped breathing. Grief washed over her like a tidal wave. Her only companion in this harsh world, her precious child, was gone. Her joy turned to bitterness, and her hope crumbled into despair. In her anguish, she turned to Elijah. "What do you have against me, man of God?" she cried. "Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Her words were sharp, but they revealed the depth of her pain. Like many in moments of loss, she searched for answers, even if it meant questioning God's messenger. Elijah, moved by the widow's grief, took the lifeless boy from her arms. arms. Carrying him to the upper room where he was staying, Elijah laid the child on his bed. What followed was a prayer of raw emotion and deep faith. "O Lord my God," Elijah cried out, "have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with, by causing her son to die?" Then, in an act of profound intercession, Elijah stretched himself over the boy 3 times. Each time, he prayed fervently, "O Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." It wasn't the act of stretching himself over the child that held power. It was Elijah's faith in God's ability to restore life. His prayers were not mere words. They were a heartfelt plea to the Creator, the one who gives and sustains life. Suddenly, something extraordinary happened. The boy's chest rose as he drew a breath. Life returned to his body, and his eyes opened. Elijah's prayers had been answered. Carrying the boy back downstairs, Elijah presented him to his mother, saying, "Your son is alive." Imagine the widow's reaction. One moment, she had been plunged into the depths of despair. The next, she was holding her living, breathing child in her arms. Overwhelmed with gratitude, she declared, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." Elijah's story reminds us that faith often requires stepping out of our comfort zones, trusting in God's provision and timing. The widow's obedience to Elijah's instructions and her willingness to share her last meal opened the door to God's miraculous intervention. But perhaps the greatest lesson is this: God is the giver of life, both physical and spiritual. Just as he restored the widow's son, he restores us through his love and grace. As you prepare to rest tonight, let this story remind you that God sees your struggles and hears your prayers. Whether you're facing loss, uncertainty, or fear, his power is greater than any challenge. Just as he provided for the widow and revived her son, he is capable of bringing new life to your circumstances. So rest in his promises, and may his peace fill your heart as you drift off to sleep. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, preserved in the fire, Daniel 3 verses 19 to 27. Our story takes place in the ancient land of Babylon, a vast and mighty kingdom known for its grand palaces, towering walls, and impressive gardens. At the heart of this powerful empire was King Nebuchadnezzar, a ruler feared for his military might and admired for his grand visions. His conquests had made Babylon the most powerful kingdom in the world, and his pride knew no bounds. One day, King Nebuchadnezzar had a grand idea. He wanted to create a symbol of his power and authority that would be visible to everyone in the kingdom. So, he commanded his artisans to construct a massive golden image. This statue was not just any idol. It stood nearly 90 feet tall, gleaming in the sunlight like a beacon of the king's glory. It was a symbol of his absolute power and a demand for the complete loyalty of his subjects. With the statue completed, King Nebuchadnezzar issued a decree that echoed throughout the land. At the sound of music, everyone in the kingdom must bow down and worship the golden image. Anyone who refuses will be thrown into a blazing furnace. The king's command was clear and terrifying. The people of Babylon, from the highest officials to the lowest servants, knew the consequences of disobedience. The furnace was a place of certain death, a fiery pit that consumed everything in its path. Among the people of Babylon were 3 young Jewish men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men had been exiled from their homeland, Judah, after King Nebuchadnezzar's conquest. Despite their circumstances, they had risen to high positions in the king's court because of their wisdom and integrity. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were devout followers of the one true God. They had learned from their ancestors that worshipping idols was wrong, and that they should remain faithful to God, no matter what. When they heard the king's decree, they knew they had a difficult choice to make. The day of the dedication of the golden image arrived. As the sound of music filled the air, people from all over the kingdom gathered around the statue. The moment the music played, everyone fell to their knees, bowing before the golden image. But in the midst of the crowd, 3 figures stood tall and unmoved: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Their refusal to worship the idol did not go unnoticed. Word of their defiance quickly reached the king, who was furious. How dare these men disobey his command? Nebuchadnezzar summoned them to his court, his anger burning as brightly as the furnace he had threatened them. Imagine the tension in the room as King Nebuchadnezzar, his face flushed with rage, confronted the 3 men. "Is it true," he demanded, "that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? If you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" The king's words were both a challenge and a threat. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego remained calm and unwavering in their faith. They replied with a courage that surprised even the king. "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Their words echoed through the court like thunder. Their faith was not based on the outcome, but on their unshakable trust in God. Whether he chose to save them or not, they would remain faithful. Nebuchadnezzar's fury reached its peak. His face contorted with rage, and he ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Soldiers bound Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with ropes and led them to their fate. The heat was so intense that it consumed the soldiers, who threw them into the furnace. As the 3 men fell into the roaring flames, it seemed to everyone watching that their fate was sealed. But this was no ordinary fire. Inside the furnace, something incredible happened. Nebuchadnezzar, watching from a safe distance, leapt to his feet in astonishment. "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" he asked. "Yes, your majesty," his advisors replied. The king's voice trembled as he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. The fire that was meant to destroy them had no power over them. Not a hair on their heads was singed. Their clothes were untouched by the flames, and they didn't even smell of smoke." The presence of the 4th figure, often understood to be a divine being, perhaps even a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, was a visible reminder that they were not alone. Nebuchadnezzar approached the furnace and called out, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here." The 3 men stepped out of the fire, completely unharmed. The officials, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them, marveling at what they saw. The same king who had challenged, "What God will be able to rescue you?" now stood in awe of the God who had done exactly that. Nebuchadnezzar declared, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants." They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. This story is a powerful reminder of God's sovereignty and faithfulness. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't know how their story would end, but they trusted in God's plan, whether it included deliverance or not. Their courage inspires us to stand firm in our faith, even when the pressures of life seem overwhelming. The presence of the 4th figure in the fire is a beautiful symbol of God's nearness. Just as he was with them in their trial, he is with us in our struggles, providing strength and comfort. Nebuchadnezzar's declaration also reminds us that God's power is undeniable. Even a king as proud and powerful as Nebuchadnezzar was forced to acknowledge the Most High God. As you reflect on this story, consider the fires you might be facing in your own life. They may not be literal flames, but they could be challenges, fears, or uncertainties. This story assures us that God's presence is with us, even in the midst of the most intense trials. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we are called to trust in God's faithfulness, even when the outcome is unclear. Their story reminds us that our faith is not just about what God does for us, but about who He is, a God who is worthy of our trust and worship. The miracle of Lazarus, a story of faith, love, and resurrection. In the small village of Bethany, nestled near the bustling city of Jerusalem, lived two sisters named Mary and Martha. They were known for their kindness and hospitality, often opening their home to travelers and friends. But their home was especially dear to one particular visitor, Jesus of Nazareth. He had become a close friend to the sisters and their brother, Lazarus, who also lived with them. One day, tragedy struck the little household. Lazarus fell gravely ill. Mary and Martha, filled with worry, knew that they needed help beyond their own abilities. They had heard of Jesus' miracles and His compassionate heart, so they sent a message to Him, hoping He would come quickly. The message was simple but filled with urgency. Lord, the one you love is sick. Imagine the sisters' anxiety as they waited for a response. They didn't ask Jesus for anything specific. They didn't demand that He come immediately or heal Lazarus from a distance. They simply laid their need before Him, trusting in His love and compassion. When Jesus received the message, He said something unexpected. This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. His disciples, who were with Him, were puzzled. How could this be? Lazarus was on the brink of death. How could his illness lead to God's glory? Instead of rushing to Bethany, Jesus stayed where He was for 2 more days. This delay must have been confusing and even frustrating for the disciples. Why would Jesus, who loved Lazarus, wait when time was so critical? But Jesus had a divine purpose. His delay was not a sign of neglect or indifference, but of perfect timing. He knew that this moment would serve as a powerful testament to God's glory and as a revelation of His own identity as the resurrection and the life. Finally, Jesus announced, "Let us go back to Judea." The disciples, however, were hesitant. "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back." They feared for His safety. Jesus reassured them with words that pointed to His divine mission. Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. He was reminding them that as long as they walked with Him, they were safe. Then He added, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." The disciples, still misunderstanding, replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." They thought Lazarus was simply resting. Jesus clarified, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." His words were a gentle rebuke and a call to faith. By the time Jesus arrived in Bethany, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. The village was steeped in mourning, and many people had come to comfort Mary and Martha in their loss. The air was thick with sorrow. Martha, ever the active and pragmatic one, went out to meet Jesus as He approached. Her words were a mixture of faith and sorrow. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Despite her grief, she still believed in Jesus' power. Jesus replied, your brother will rise again." Martha, thinking he was speaking of the final resurrection, said, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." She believed in the afterlife, but she longed for her brother's life to be restored now. Then Jesus made a declaration that would change everything. "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Do you believe this? His words were a profound statement of his identity and power. "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." Martha's faith was unwavering, even in the face of death. Martha then went to fetch Mary, who was still weeping at home. When Mary came to Jesus, she fell at his feet and echoed her sister's words, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Her grief was palpable. Jesus, deeply moved by their grief and the weeping crowd, asked, "Where have you laid him?" "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And then, in the shortest yet one of the most profound verses of the Bible, we read, "Jesus wept." His tears were a testament to his deep compassion and love for his friends. Arriving at the tomb, a cave with a stone laid across the entrance, Jesus instructed, "Take away the stone." Martha hesitated, reminding him that Lazarus had been dead for 4 days and that there would be a terrible odor. But Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" His words were a call to faith. The stone was rolled away, and Jesus lifted his eyes to heaven. "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." His prayer was a declaration of his unity with God. Then, with a loud voice, he called out, "Lazarus, come out." At his command, something extraordinary happened. Lazarus, still wrapped in grave clothes, emerged from the tomb. The crowd must have gasped in disbelief, their mourning turning to astonishment. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." In that moment, death was defeated. The miracle was undeniable, and many who witnessed it put their faith in Jesus. As you drift into sleep, let this story remind you of God's power, love, and faithfulness. Whatever you may be facing, know that Jesus is with you, ready to speak life into your circumstances. Rest in the peace of his presence, and let your heart be filled with the hope of resurrection. May you find comfort and strength in the knowledge that Jesus is the Lord of life, and he is always with you, even in the darkest of times. Elisha and the Shunammite woman's son, a tale of faith, heartbreak, and miraculous restoration. Our story unfolds in the picturesque village of Shunem, a charming settlement nestled in the fertile Jezreel Valley of ancient Israel. Here, life was simple yet vibrant, with the gentle hum of daily activities and the lush greenery providing a serene backdrop. Among the villagers was a remarkable woman. Though her name remains a mystery to us, her actions speak volumes about her character. This woman was not just any villager. She was wealthy and influential, known for her kindness and generosity. Her heart was always open to those in need, and her home was a place of warmth and hospitality. Whenever Elisha, the revered prophet of God, passed through her village, she would insist that he stop by her home to share a meal. Her kindness was not fleeting. It was a consistent expression of her deep respect and admiration for the man of God. Over time, her acts of kindness grew into a heartfelt desire to provide even more for Elisha. She approached her husband with a thoughtful plan. "Let's make a small room on the roof," she suggested, "and furnish it with a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp for him. Then he can stay there whenever he comes to us." Can you picture this room? It was a humble space, yet filled with love and care. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was perfect. A a quiet sanctuary for Elisha during his travels. The woman's generosity was a reflection of her gratitude for the blessings in her life and her desire to honor God's servant. Elisha was deeply touched by her kindness. He wanted to bless her in return, but he needed to understand her heart's deepest desires. Through his servant Gehazi, Elisha discovered a longing she had not spoken aloud. She had no child. Her husband was advanced in years, and the hope of having a family seemed like a dream long faded away. But Elisha, guided by the Spirit of God, made a bold and unexpected promise. "About this time next year," he declared, "you will hold a son in your arms." The woman's response was a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "No, my lord," she said, "don't mislead your servant." She was afraid to hope, afraid to believe that such a miracle could happen. But as surely as God had spoken through his prophet, the promise came true. Within a year, she cradled a baby boy in her arms, her heart overflowing with gratitude and joy. The years passed, and the boy grew strong and healthy, bringing immense joy to his parents. One day, as he was out in the fields with his father, something unexpected and terrifying happened. The boy suddenly cried out, "My head! My head!" His father, concerned but unable to leave his work, told a servant to carry the boy back to his mother. The Shunammite woman held her son in her arms, comforting him as any loving mother would. She cradled him, whispered soothing words, and tried to ease his pain. But as the hours passed, the unthinkable happened. The boy, her promised child, her miracle, took his last breath and died. Imagine the depth of her grief. This was the child she had not dared to hope for, the child who was a precious gift from God, and now he was gone. The pain was overwhelming, a crushing weight that threatened to shatter her world. But this woman's faith was extraordinary. She didn't succumb to despair or allow herself to be consumed by sorrow. Instead, she made a decision that revealed the depth of her trust in God and his prophet. She took her son's lifeless body and laid him on Elisha's bed, the very place where the man of God had rested. Then, without hesitation, she set out to find Elisha. Determined and unwavering, the Shunammite woman saddled a donkey and instructed her servant, "Lead on. Don't slow down for me unless I tell you." Her heart was set on reaching Mount Carmel, where Elisha was staying. As she approached, Elisha saw her in the distance and sent Gehazi to meet her. "Are you all right?" Gehazi asked. "Is your husband all right? Is your child all right?" "Everything is all right," the woman replied. But when she reached Elisha, she fell at his feet and poured out her anguish. "Did I ask you for a son, my lord? Didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes?" Her words were filled with pain and a desperate plea for help. Elisha, deeply moved by her grief, understood the gravity of the situation. He sent Gehazi ahead with his staff, instructing him to place it on the boy's face. But the Shunammite woman refused to leave Elisha's side. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you," she declared. Her faith was unwavering. She believed that Elisha, as God's prophet, held the key to her son's restoration. So Elisha followed her back to Shunem, his heart heavy with compassion and determination. When Elisha arrived at the woman's home, the atmosphere was somber. The boy lay lifeless on the bed, a heartbreaking sight. Elisha entered the room and shut the door, leaving only himself and the child. What happened next was both extraordinary and deeply personal. Elisha prayed to the Lord, pouring out his heart in intercession. His prayer was not a mere ritual. It was a heartfelt plea, a conversation with God filled with hope and faith. Then, Elisha performed a mysterious and symbolic act. He stretched himself out over the child, aligning his eyes, mouth, and hands with the boy's. This act was a powerful symbol of his connection with the child and his faith in God's power to restore life. At first, nothing happened, but Elisha didn't give up. He walked back and forth in the room, praying and seeking God's intervention. His faith was unwavering, his determination unshakable. Then he stretched himself out over the boy a second time. Suddenly, the boy sneezed, not once but 7 times. His eyes opened, and life returned to his body. Can you imagine the joy that filled that room? Elisha called Gehazi and said, "Call the Shunammite woman." When she came, Elisha said, "Take your son." She fell at Elisha's feet in gratitude, and then embraced her son. Her tears of sorrow transformed into tears of joy. The promise that had seemed lost was restored, and her heart overflowed with gratitude and relief. The story of the Shunammite woman and her son is a powerful testament to God's faithfulness. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments, when hope seems lost, God is able to bring life and restoration. This woman's journey was not easy. She experienced the joy of a fulfilled promise and the heartbreak of that promise seemingly taken away. Yet through it all, she demonstrated unwavering faith. She sought God through his prophet, believing that he could do what seemed impossible. Elisha's actions also teach us about persistence in prayer. He didn't give up when the boy didn't revive immediately. He continued to seek God, trusting in his power to bring life where there was death. This story encourages us to hold on to hope, even when circumstances seem dire. It reminds us that God is always at work, even when we can't see it. The Shunammite woman's faith and Elisha's persistence inspire us to trust in God's goodness and to believe that he can restore what is broken. The Shunammite woman's story also highlights the power of a grateful heart. Her initial acts of kindness towards Elisha were not driven by a desire for reward, but by a genuine spirit of generosity. Yet, it was her gratitude that opened the door for God's blessings in her life. Her gratitude was not just a fleeting emotion, it was a way of life. It was reflected in her actions, her words, and her willingness to open her home to Elisha. Her gratitude was a testament to her faith and her understanding of God's goodness. When tragedy struck, her gratitude did not waver. Instead, it fueled her faith and gave her the strength to seek God's intervention. Her story teaches us that a grateful heart is a powerful force. It opens us up to God's blessings and strengthens our faith in his promises. As you reflect on this story, consider the promises God has made in your life. Have you ever felt like a promise was delayed or even taken away? The Shunammite woman's story encourages us to hold on to faith, even in the face of loss or doubt. Remember, God's timing is perfect, and his power is unmatched. He is the God who restores, who breathes life into dead dreams and hopeless situations. Elisha's persistence in prayer is also a call for us to keep seeking God, even when answers don't come immediately. Like Elisha, we are invited to trust in God's faithfulness and to believe that he is at work, even when we cannot see it. Enoch, the man who walked with God, Genesis 5 verse 24. Our story begins in the genealogies of Genesis, where the early generations of humanity are listed. Name after name, we read of men who lived long lives, had children, and eventually died. Each name is a reminder of humanity's mortality. Lives measured in centuries, but still marked by the inevitable death. But then, amidst the rhythm of, and he died, one name breaks the pattern: Enoch. Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, was born into a world vastly different from ours. It was a world closer to the beginning of time, where the memories of Eden and the fall of humanity still lingered like a distant echo. People lived for hundreds of years, and yet their lives were still finite. Death claimed them all, until Enoch. The Bible doesn't tell us much about Enoch's early years, but what it does say is profound. Genesis 5 verse 22 reveals that Enoch walked with God. This simple phrase carries immense weight. To walk with God means to live in constant communion with Him, to align your steps with His, and to seek His presence in all things. It's not just about obeying His commands. It's about a relationship so deep and personal that it shapes every moment of your life. Imagine Enoch's days. As the sun rose and set, as he tended to his daily tasks, his heart was always turned toward God. Perhaps he marveled at the beauty of creation, seeing the fingerprints of his Creator in every blade of grass, every whisper of the wind. Perhaps he spoke with God as one speaks with a dear friend, sharing his joys, his sorrows, his hopes, and his dreams. Enoch's life wasn't marked by extraordinary deeds or dramatic events. At least, none that the Bible records. Instead, it was his quiet, faithful walk with God that set him apart. Genesis 5 verse 24 gives us the extraordinary conclusion to Enoch's earthly life. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more, because God took him away. These words are shrouded in mystery. What does it mean that God took him away? The New Testament offers a bit more insight. Hebrews 11 verse 5 explains, "By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God." Can you imagine what that moment must have been like? One day, Enoch was walking with God, as he always did. Perhaps he was praying, or perhaps he was simply enjoying the presence of his Creator. And then, in an instant, he was gone, swept into the very presence of God, not through the doorway of death, but through an invitation into eternal life. It's a moment so extraordinary, so unique, that it defies explanation. Enoch's departure wasn't just a miracle. It was a divine affirmation of the life he lived. Enoch's story invites us to ponder a profound question. What does it mean to walk with God? To walk with God is to live in close fellowship with Him. It's not about perfection, it's about direction. It's about turning your heart toward Him, seeking His presence in the ordinary and the extraordinary. For Enoch, this walk wasn't a one-time decision. It was a daily journey. Every step he took was guided by his relationship with God. He didn't just believe in God, he lived for Him, with Him, and through Him. In our own lives, walking with God might look different. It might mean starting your day with prayer, inviting Him into your decisions, and seeking His wisdom in times of uncertainty. It might mean worshiping Him in the quiet moments, finding joy in His creation, and trusting Him even when the path ahead is unclear. Though Enoch's story is brief, his legacy is eternal. He is one of only 2 people in the Bible, along with the prophet Elijah, who was taken to heaven without experiencing death. His life is a testament to the power of faith and the beauty of a life lived in close relationship with God. Enoch's story also points us forward to the promise of eternal life for all who walk with God. His miraculous departure is a glimpse of the hope we have in Christ. A hope that death is not the end, but a doorway into the presence of God. As you reflect on Enoch's story, consider your own walk with God. Are there areas of your life where you can draw closer to Him? Are there steps of faith you've been hesitant to take? Enoch's life reminds us that walking with God isn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It's about the daily choice to seek Him, to trust Him, and to invite Him into every part of our lives. The story of Enoch is more than a historical account. It's an invitation. It's an invitation to walk with God in your own life, to experience the joy and peace that come from His presence, and to live with the hope of eternity in your heart. Just as God walked with Enoch, He desires to walk with you. He is not distant or detached. He is near, ready to guide your steps and carry your burdens. As you drift off to sleep tonight, Let Enoch's story fill your heart with peace and hope. Imagine yourself walking with God, step by step, through the journey of life. Feel the comfort of His presence, the assurance of His love, and the promise of His faithfulness. Rest in the knowledge that the same God who walked with Enoch walks with you, inviting you into a relationship that will carry you not only through this life, but into eternity. Elijah's fiery departure, a tale of faith, legacy, and divine glory. 2 Kings 2 verses 11 to 12. Elijah's story is one of the most remarkable in the Bible, filled with drama, miracles, and a departure so extraordinary that it has been recounted for centuries. But before we delve into that awe-inspiring moment, let us reflect on the deep bond between Elijah and his faithful protege, Elisha. Elijah was a prophet of unparalleled boldness. He stood fearlessly against kings, challenged the worship of false gods, and even called down fire from heaven. His life was marked by miraculous power, yet it was also a life of profound loneliness. He often stood alone in his mission, a solitary figure in a world that had turned away from God. But God had a plan to ensure that Elijah's work would continue. He handpicked a man named Elisha to carry on Elijah's prophetic mantle. From the moment Elijah placed his cloak on Elisha's shoulders, a sacred bond was formed. Elisha was willing to leave everything behind, his home, his family, and his livelihood, to follow Elijah and serve as his apprentice. Their relationship was one of deep mentorship, unwavering loyalty, and a spiritual connection that transcended the ordinary. As Elijah's time on earth drew to a close, God revealed to both him and Elisha that the end was near. Together, they embarked on a journey that would take them to several significant locations, each with its own rich history and spiritual significance. Their first stop was Gilgal, a place where the Israelites had first camped after crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land. It was a place of beginnings, of God's faithfulness and provision. From there, they traveled to Bethel, a city with a long history of worship and divine encounters. Then they journeyed to Jericho, a city that had once been a symbol of God's power and victory. At each stop, Elijah gave Elisha the opportunity to stay behind. But each time, Elisha refused, declaring with unwavering determination, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." Imagine the emotions Elisha must have felt. He knew that his mentor, his guide, and his spiritual father was about to leave him. But even in the face of this impending loss, he stayed close, determined to witness whatever God had planned. His loyalty was not just to Elijah, but to the God who had called them both. Their journey brought them to the Jordan River, a place rich with history and symbolism. It was the same river where Joshua had led the Israelites into the Promised Land, a powerful symbol of God's faithfulness and his ability to bring his people into a place of blessing. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water. The river parted, and the two men crossed on dry ground. It was a moment that mirrored the mighty acts of God in the past, a reminder of his power and faithfulness. As they crossed, Elisha must have felt the weight of the moment. He knew that Elijah's departure was imminent, and he wanted to be ready. The parting of the Jordan was not just a physical journey. It was a symbolic crossing into a new phase of his life. Once they were on the other side, Elijah turned to Elisha and asked, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Elisha's response was bold and filled with faith. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." This was not a request for material wealth or worldly power. Elisha was not seeking fame or fortune. He was asking for the spiritual power and authority to continue the work Elijah had started. He wanted to serve God with the same passion, boldness, and faith as his mentor. Elijah acknowledged the difficulty of the request, but gave Elisha a promise. If you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not. Elisha's request was a testament to his deep desire to carry on Elijah's legacy. He understood that the true measure of a prophet was not in the miracles they performed, but in the Spirit of God that empowered them. He longed for that same Spirit, that same connection with God, to guide him in his own prophetic ministry. And then it happened. As they walked together, a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared, separating the two men. Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, his cloak falling to the ground as he ascended. Can you imagine the scene? The blinding light, the roar of the whirlwind, the overwhelming sense of God's presence. It was a moment of both awe and sorrow, a divine departure that left Elisha standing alone. Elisha watched as his mentor disappeared into the heavens, crying out, "My father, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." His cry was one of reverence and grief, a recognition of the spiritual power that had just departed from the earth. The imagery of the chariot of fire and the whirlwind is powerful and symbolic. It represents the divine glory and power that accompanied Elijah's departure. It was a fitting end to a life marked by God's miraculous intervention. When the whirlwind had gone, all that remained was Elijah's cloak, a symbol of his prophetic authority. Elisha picked it up, knowing that the mantle had been passed to him. As he returned to the Jordan River, Elisha put his faith to the test. Striking the water with Elijah's cloak, he cried out, "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The river parted, just as it had before, and Elisha crossed over. The prophets who were watching from a distance recognized that the spirit of Elijah now rested on Elisha. The transition was complete. Elisha was no longer the apprentice. He was now the prophet of Israel, carrying on the mission of speaking God's truth to his people. The parting of the Jordan was a confirmation of God's blessing on Elisha's ministry. It was a sign that he had received the double portion he had requested, and that God's power was with him. Elijah's fiery departure is more than just a dramatic story. It is a profound reminder of God's power, his faithfulness, and his ability to work through ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. It is also a story about legacy. Elijah didn't just leave behind miracles or stories. He left behind a successor who would carry on his work. Elisha's bold request for a double portion of Elijah's spirit shows us the importance of spiritual inheritance and the desire to continue God's mission. Elijah's story challenges us to consider the legacy we are leaving behind. Who are the Galicious in our lives? Those who look to us for guidance, encouragement, and inspiration. How are we investing in the next generation, passing on the truths and values that matter most? And finally, it is a story about the hope of heaven. Elijah's ascent in the whirlwind is a glimpse of the eternal life that awaits those who walk with God. It reminds us that this world is not our final destination, and that one day we too will be called into his presence. As you reflect on Elijah's story, consider the ways God is calling you to leave a legacy of faith. Who are the Galicious in your life? Those who look to you for guidance, encouragement, and inspiration. How can you invest in them, sharing the wisdom and experience you have gained? Think about the spiritual gifts and blessings God has given you. Are you using them to serve others and advance God's kingdom? Are you willing to pass them on, empowering others to continue the work God has called you to? And just as Elijah's story points us to heaven, let it remind you of the hope we have in Christ. One day, we too will be called into his presence, not in a chariot of fire, but in the arms of our Savior. Dear God, as we reflect on Elijah's story, we are reminded of the importance of leaving a legacy of faith. Help us to be faithful stewards of the gifts and blessings you have given us. Give us the courage to invest in the next generation, passing on the truths and values that matter most. Help us to be bold in our faith, like Elijah, and to trust in your power and faithfulness. Give us the wisdom to recognize the malicious in our lives and the grace to mentor and guide them. And as we face the challenges of this life, let us hold on to the hope of heaven. Remind us that this world is not our final destination, and that one day we will be called into your presence. Thank you for the example of Elijah and Elisha, and for the lessons we can learn from their story. Help us to live lives of faith, hope, and love, and to leave a legacy that honors you. In Jesus' name, amen. As you settle into rest tonight, let the story of Elijah's fiery departure fill your heart with wonder and peace. Picture the chariot of fire, the whirlwind, and the promise of God's power and presence. Know that the same God who called Elijah home is watching over you, guiding your steps and preparing a place for you in his eternal kingdom. The Widow of Nain, a story of compassion, power, and restoration. In a small, humble village nestled in the hills of ancient Israel, there lived a woman whose life had been deeply scarred by sorrow. She had already experienced the heart-wrenching loss of her husband, the man who had been her partner, protector, and provider. Now the cruel hand of fate had struck again, taking away her only son, her last source of support, comfort, and hope for the future. Can you imagine her heartache? In those times, widows were among the most vulnerable members of society. They relied on their sons for their livelihood, protection, and social standing. Without her son, this woman faced not only the overwhelming pain of her loss, but also an uncertain and frightening future. Her son's death was more than a personal tragedy. It was a loss that left her utterly alone and vulnerable in every way. The village, though small, was a close-knit community, and her neighbors came together to mourn with her. A solemn funeral procession formed, and the widow, her heart heavy with grief, walked behind the bier carrying her son's lifeless body. The air was filled with the sound of wailing, a haunting melody of sorrow and despair that echoed through the hills and valleys. As the procession made its way out of the town gate, another group approached from the opposite direction. At the head of this group was Jesus, the renowned teacher and healer, accompanied by his disciples and a large crowd of followers. The two groups couldn't have been more different. One was filled with mourning, loss, and the weight of despair. The other, following Jesus, was likely abuzz with hope, anticipation, and the excitement of being in the presence of a man who had performed countless miracles. When Jesus saw the widow, he stopped. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, something profound happened. The Bible tells us that Jesus was filled with compassion for her. He didn't just see a grieving woman. He saw her pain, her loneliness, her fears, and her broken heart. His heart went out to her in a way that was deeply personal and profoundly divine. As Jesus approached the widow, he spoke just two simple words: "Don't cry." Think about that for a moment. In the midst of her overwhelming grief, Jesus offered words of comfort that seemed almost impossible to believe. How could she not cry when her world had been torn apart? Her son, her only source of hope, was gone. Yet there was something in Jesus' tone, something in his presence, that must have given her pause. These weren't empty words meant to dismiss her pain or minimize her loss. Instead, they were a prelude to a miracle that would change everything. Jesus' words were filled with compassion and a promise of hope that transcended her current circumstances. Then, Jesus did something that must have shocked everyone present. He walked up to the bier, the open coffin carrying the young man's body, and touched it. In that culture, touching a dead body or anything associated with it made a person ceremonially unclean. But Jesus wasn't concerned with cultural taboos or appearances. His touch was an act of divine authority. a bold statement that defied the laws of nature and revealed his power over death itself. The pallbearers stopped, and the crowd fell silent. All eyes were on Jesus as he spoke directly to the young man. "Young man, I say to you, get up." And then the unthinkable happened. The young man sat up and began to speak. Life returned to his body, and the crowd gasped in amazement. The air, which had been filled with the sound of mourning, was now filled with awe and wonder. Imagine the widow's reaction. One moment, she was walking in a funeral procession, her heart shattered by grief, her future uncertain and bleak. The next moment, her son was alive again, sitting up and speaking as though nothing had happened. Jesus didn't just bring the young man back to life, he restored a family. He gave a mother her son, a widow her hope, and a community a reason to believe. With gentle words, Jesus handed the young man back to his mother, and her tears of sorrow turned into tears of joy. The Bible doesn't tell us what the young man said, but we can imagine the reunion. The mother's cries of joy, the son's confusion turned to gratitude, and the crowd's stunned silence giving way to praise. It was a moment of pure joy and relief, a testament to the power of God's love and compassion. The miracle didn't just impact the widow and her son. It left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. The crowd was filled with awe and began praising God, saying, "A great prophet has appeared among us, and God has come to help his people." News of this miracle spread quickly throughout Judea and the surrounding countryside. People were astonished not only by Jesus' power, but also by his compassion. In a world often marked by suffering and loss, this act of divine intervention was a beacon of hope. People talked about the miracle in hushed tones, their hearts filled with wonder and gratitude. The story of the widow's son being raised from the dead became a source of inspiration and a testament to the power of faith. As you think about this story, let it remind you of the compassion of Jesus. He didn't perform this miracle to draw attention to himself or to prove a point. He did it because his heart was moved by the widow's pain. His compassion was not just a fleeting emotion. It was a deep, abiding love that compelled him to act. And consider the power of his words. With a simple command, he brought life back to a lifeless body. This wasn't just a display of supernatural power. It was a glimpse of who Jesus is, the Lord of life, the one who has authority over death itself. It was a powerful reminder that Jesus is not bound by the limitations of this world. What does this story mean for us today? First, it reminds us that Jesus sees our pain. Just as he saw the widow in Nain, he sees you, your struggles, your fears, your sorrows, and your heartaches. His heart goes out to you, and he offers comfort in ways that are both personal and profound. He is not a distant God. He is a loving Father who cares deeply for his children. Second, it shows us that no situation is beyond his power. Whether it's physical death, spiritual emptiness, emotional despair, or any other challenge we face, Jesus has the authority to bring life and hope. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and his power is limitless. Finally, it encourages us to trust in his timing. The widow didn't expect her son to be raised that day, but Jesus stepped into her life at the perfect moment. In the same way, he is working in your life, even when you can't see it. He knows the plans he has for you, plans for your welfare and not for harm, to give you a future and a hope. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let the story of the widow of Nain's son fill your heart with peace and hope. Picture the moment when sorrow turned to joy, when a funeral procession became a celebration of life. Remember that the same Jesus who brought life to that young man is with you now, ready to bring comfort, healing, and hope into your life. Imagine Jesus standing beside you, just as he stood beside the widow. Feel his presence, his love, and His compassion. Know that He is with you in your darkest moments, offering hope and strength. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let the story of the widow of Nain's son fill your heart with peace and hope. Picture the moment when sorrow turned to joy, when a funeral procession became a celebration of life. Remember that the same Jesus who brought life to that young man is with you now, ready to bring comfort, healing, and hope into your life. Rest in His love, and let your soul be renewed by the knowledge that He is always near. Hope you have subscribed to keep in touch. There is soothing sounds to guide you towards a heavenly sleep. God bless you.